Hello again. I'm continuing the scene from where we left off. I just want to fragment this technical knowledge so both of our brains won't get overwhelmed. So in order to create cloth, I'm going to duplicate this object, Command D, turn the previous one off, and then I'm just going to remove every single one of the components that I see. All I care about is the positioning of this transform. Absolutely everything. Now I'm going to go into component. I'm going to add either interactive cloth or just add a cloth render, and the interactive cloth will be added by default. Skin cloth is something to be used with characters in order to make dresses or capes. In this tutorial, we're only going to be concerned with interactive cloth. So I'm going to add cloth renderer, and it acts interactive cloth by default. So obviously we see nothing here. In order to actually get the mesh, we go into the mesh parameter, select this image, or this mesh, excuse me. It says Bezier curve, probably could use a better name. Okay, has no material. And I'm going to apply this feather pen material. Okay, obviously it looks a little darker than the other feather, but that's okay because in play mode the normals will calculate correctly. Let's give this a proper name, and we're going to rename the soft feather. Okay, let's just check this out with the default values. Okay, and we see that the feather wraps around the rock and then falls down. Let's break it before we make it and take a look at some of these other parameters. So the stretching stiffness implies how much the mesh will stretch, how much the distance will be between one vertex and another. Bending stiffness implies the same thing. Well, meaning the same stiffness, but how much the objects can bend. So for example, if I set it to 1, press play, we see that it doesn't bend as much. And for the most part it looks okay. But we're not done yet. I'm going to keep this as 1, and I'm going to go on to damping. This will simply damp the cloth motion. Value goes from 0 to 1. Okay, and we see that it doesn't really fall down as easily. Or it does fall down the same, but it doesn't move around as much when it falls. Now, like all cloth solvers, there is actually another mesh that's created on top of the mesh that we have here, on top of the mesh that we see. So this other mesh has some parameters which are not shared with the mesh that the cloth is being applied on. And this matters for the thickness parameter. So for example, it's at 0.2. If I set it to 5 times its value, to 1, we will see that the mesh now, well, it doesn't exactly conform to the shape of the objects that it falls on. Now, this might not seem very useful, but for example, if it's too light, we might see some penetration. And it starts falling through the other objects. It folds a little bit too much onto itself, so the default value of 0.2 is good enough. The use gravity checkbox is a Boolean value which asks to use the gravity global settings. This can be found in Edit, Project Settings, Physics. And here's gravity. Gravity can be applied to either one of the sides. In this case, it's the default. Self-collision, if your mesh is a hat, maybe some of the edges will overlap on the other edges, and you will want the hat to actually stay stable and not to have interpenetrations. The next two parameters are pretty similar. This implies constant. This implies random constant. So if you want, for example, some of the feather to be swaying in the wind, you might imply some sort of random parameter here on the x. Actually, on the z would probably be the most relevant. So let's give this a value of 100 and see the difference. Okay, so it starts swaying, and you can immediately see the problem. There is no detection when it actually hits the ground, because it doesn't know what the ground is. It will continue moving. We'll solve this problem another way. Friction will imply how much friction there is in the cloth. If we set this to 1, you will see that the feather really sticks on to the object that it falls on. Going to set this to, say, 0.75 in the middle. I do want to test see how it looks. You know, I actually liked it before at 0.5. I'm going to keep it at that. Okay, I'm going to quickly run through these values. Density is how dense the cloth is. This is how much pressure is inside the cloth. Collision response is how much force will be applied to the colliding rigid bodies. Now, this attachment, both of these attachments, I will cover in one moment, and the tear factor will imply how far the vertices will need to stretch before they start to tear. 0 means disabled. Okay, we're going to get to this in a second. Let's watch it tear at first. And watch the feather come apart. Okay, it's folding. And it's really colliding. Let's see if we can set it to something even lower. 1,000th. Okay, let's see, is it coming apart? Yes, and we are seeing some triangles coming apart on one another. Probably not something that we want, but if you adjust a few of the other settings, this might come in useful. Disabled. Okay, all this attached parameters. We will not be using this for this feather, but there is an effect which you might find it useful, and that is flags. We're going to go and create I just want to create a box collider, and this is simply an easier way to create one rather than going through these settings, because I can move it around with the move tool. Okay, so now to this looks like a tongue. It's pretty funny. If I want to attach a collider onto the mesh, then the mesh vertices will stick on to the collider that it's attached onto. They must overlap. So currently it's overlapping, and I need to go into the feather here, set the array to at least 1, and just drag the cube in here. Two-way interactive means that it will affect the collider here as well. Tearable implies that it can tear. So I'm actually going to turn off the renderer. Don't want to see it. And let's test it out. Okay, and we see that it actually stays on. This will probably not be the effect that we want, but along with something more flag-like, and if you change some of the external or the random external options, you can probably get a pretty good flag effect. And this will also be a two-way response, and how much force can be applied to the attached rigid bodies, and how far they will need to be stretched before they can tear off if tearable is selected. So I'm going to turn all of this off, and I want to address Another problem that we're having